Imagine losing a month's salary every single year for the next 5 years, and it's not even for your own country. Analysis from the New Economics Foundation reveals that meeting NATO's 5% of GDP defense target would require EU NATO members to increase defense spending by 613 billion euros annually. Even sticking to the 3.5% core defense target alone would mean about 360 billion euros extra per year. With approximately 447 million people in the EU27, the 613 billion euros works out to around 1,370 euros per person annually, or about 115 euros per person per month, or simply a month's salary. Not for domestic priorities like healthcare or infrastructure, but largely for a military build-up shaped by NATO policy. And with US defense companies positioned to capture a significant share of this spending, the burden on European taxpayers is directly linked to transatlantic economic interests. "Europe's having a moment right now," said Greg Kausner, an executive for American defense technology company Anduril. He was, of course, referring to NATO's changed policy that requires member nations to spend 5% of their GDP on defense and security-related capabilities. According to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, this new policy could amount to trillions of extra dollars. That's actually in addition to the European Union's separate spending plan for Rearm Europe that sets out a $900 billion plan to boost the continent's defense strategies between 2025 and 2027. That was the moment Kausner was referring to. Europe is taking security and defense seriously, a lot more in terms of monetary spending than it ever has, and American manufacturers want in on the trade. Yes, the EU spending plan mandates that at least 65% of production be driven from within Europe. That's European companies themselves. But American dealers are confident that this revised budgeting has opened up several doors over the transatlantic. Take a look at this graph prepared by the EU in March 2025. It shows total government expenditure on defense in 2023 for EU member nations. That same year, general government expenditure on defense amounted to 227 billion euros, representing 2.7% of total general government expenditure. This is equivalent to 1.3% of GDP. Taking Anduril as an example here, the company has already established a subsidiary in the United Kingdom and, at the 2025 Paris Air Show, sealed a deal with Germany's Rheinmetall for potential development and production of a European version of its Fury drone and Barracuda low-cost cruise missile. Thereby, Anduril managed to find a way to benefit its US headquarters and meet EU requirements. But why now, right? Why is NATO encouraging its member nations to increase their security budget by 3%? What changed from when it was 2% to necessitate this increase? Trump vowed to change the United States by way of his America First campaign. Inadvertently, the campaign had far-reaching impacts that are being echoed across the globe. From tariff troubles to immigration anxieties, Trump was the one who suggested NATO should increase defense spending. At the time, it's unclear if the US president had an ulterior motive. Yes, the increased budget works well for American-based companies to pitch their productions to European counterparts, but Trump's suggestion hinted at something other than increased cooperation with the US. Quite the contrary, actually. Trump suggested that Europe should increase its defense budget because there was a very real possibility that the US would withdraw its troops from Europe soon enough. While Europe is not reliant solely on US military aid, it is reliant on military cooperation between the two. With that gone, or with it possibly being gone, Europe's looking for other solutions. A win is a win, right? The United Kingdom has announced its decision to increase its defense budget up to 2.5% by 2027. Meanwhile, Germany is still discussing the very real possibility of increased military expenditure. It's clear that we're navigating through a changing Europe, but it should be noted that European governments have stated their preference to invest domestically. How does this help Washington? The decision to increase military spending came before having enough defense manufacturers to meet the supply. While companies still have 2 more years to make the most of the increased budget, there's a high possibility that Europe-based companies will look to merge or increase co-production with US-based firms to meet demand. Simply, Europe's defense industry will likely sustain reliance on US firms for key weapons systems. Missiles and munitions, including HIMARS, AMRAAM, AIM-9X, and Patriot PAC-3 missile defense systems, are expected to be primary beneficiaries, along with the F-35 fighter jet program, though new orders may be limited due to an existing backlog. Beyond complete weapons systems, US subsystems and military components are also poised for growth through direct commercial sales. These include tactical radios, sensors, and computing platforms, with RTX, L3 Harris, Northrop Grumman, and Leonardo DRS among the key players. This isn't just a presumption made by us, it's actually something quoted directly from the Bank of America that claims that the revised budget will likely benefit US defense companies. It should be noted, however, that despite NATO announcing member nations will increase their defense budget spending to 5%, governments are not bound to do so. For example, Spain called the new spending target and 2035 deadline unreasonable. Belgium signaled that it would not get there either. Then Slovakia said it reserves the right to decide its own defense spending. This isn't to suggest, though, that they won't be increasing their budgets at all, just that the 5% goal might not be met by every nation. Other countries closer to the borders of Russia and Ukraine, such as Poland, the 3 Baltic states, and Nordic countries, have committed to the 5% goal, as have NATO's European heavyweights Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. But the 32-leader summit in the Netherlands included calls for a 2029 re-evaluation of military spending to assess if it was truly helpful. This would coincide with the next US general presidential election, although the summit claimed that it would allow them ample time to navigate Russia's growing threat to the continent. Trump took credit for the revised spending plan. He called the spending boost something that no one really thought possible. And they said, "You did it, sir. You did it." Well, I don't know if I did it, but I think I did. He also expressed his frustration at Spain. "They want to stay at 2%. I think it's terrible," he said. "You know what we're going to do? We're negotiating with Spain on a trade deal. We're going to make them pay twice as much." That sure does sound like a threat, doesn't it? Let's slightly pivot here to answer a question most of you are probably thinking right now. Why didn't Europe invest heavily in defense before? How did the United States, a single nation, develop better military technology than a whole continent? Undermining the US as just another nation would be the understatement of the century. Whatever your opinions on America may be, you have to admit that the nation has maintained a strong hold on global politics for decades. Yes, it's partly because of its exuberant military capabilities, but why didn't Europe follow suit? Clearly, it was working across the Atlantic. You see, the US operates as a global hegemon, a position cemented in large part by the post-World War II economic boom. The dominance is underpinned by unmatched power projection capabilities. Through its vast military network, the US not only safeguards its own strategic interests, but also enforces international norms that work to its advantage. When a crisis erupts in the Middle East, Washington can dispatch an aircraft carrier strike group within days. It can stage forces from partner nations, benefit from a global network of bases, and approach conflicts with confidence in conventional military superiority. This edge stems from a colossal and technologically advanced military-industrial complex, bolstered by world-leading research and development. Adding to this, the US possesses the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, giving it unmatched deterrence capabilities. European nations operate differently. Their influence is grounded in cooperative frameworks such as the EU, which provides them with substantial economic clout. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the threat of a major invasion largely evaporated for Europe. Former Warsaw Pact states joined NATO, and the EU deepened economic ties with Russia. Outside of a few exceptions like France and Britain, which retain notable expeditionary capabilities, most European governments saw themselves as surrounded by allies or stable partners. The need for large-scale militarization simply wasn't there. This began to shift over the last decade. While the 2008 invasion of Georgia signaled trouble, it was the most recent security crises that finally spurred serious rearmament efforts. Russia's aggressive posture has convinced many European capitals to reverse years of defense cuts and invest heavily in rebuilding their militaries. And now onto the larger issue.
They want to stay at 2%. I think it's terrible. And you know, they're doing very well. The economy is very well. And that economy could be blown right out of the water with something bad happening.
Trump said the United States would make Spain pay twice for not committing to the proposed 5% spending plan. What exactly did he mean by that? And can he even make a threat like that? The US, through President Trump, was combining two levers of its influence: security commitments through NATO and economic leverage through trade policy in a single pressure tactic. The US has consistently criticized its European allies for freeloading on American military protection. In Trump's framing, if the US provides security guarantees backed by the world's most capable military, its allies should meet higher spending levels. You know, to share the burden. Rather than treating NATO obligations as separate from economic negotiations, the president openly suggested using trade terms as a punitive tool against an ally that doesn't meet US preferred defense targets. Making them pay twice as much would mean a direct invoice for NATO costs. It would likely involve harsher trade conditions such as higher tariffs, reduced concessions, or other economic penalties designed to pressure compliance. Traditionally, NATO commitments and trade negotiations operate in separate lanes. Trump's framing collapses them into a single bargaining space, signaling that security guarantees could become contingent on unrelated economic concessions. This creates uncertainty for allies who depend on US defense support. It frames NATO less as a collective defense pact and more as a pay-to-play arrangement. Ironically, such threats could accelerate European moves towards strategic autonomy, as EU leaders might seek to reduce dependence on a US security guarantee that appears conditional and transactional. And that's what we're about to cover next. Take a look at this graph prepared by Pew Research in 2020. It shows that a median of 60% of adults across 16 NATO member countries believe that the US would use military force to defend a NATO ally against a Russian attack, while just 29% believe the US would not do so. It's worth noting that Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine just 2 years later in February 2022. In 2025, Trump made it clear that Europe couldn't solely rely on American military intervention any longer, despite NATO's core principle being that all member nations are allies and would come to each other's aid if and when necessary. It's also worth noting that the same research showed a sharp contrast with perceptions of other NATO member citizens' own countryhood's likelihood to intervene. Only 38% believe their own nation should defend a NATO ally under such circumstances, while 50% think they should not. This perception from 2020, Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, and the United States' stance from 2025 puts things into perspective, especially when viewing the revised NATO policies on defense expenditure. Or does it? In reality, the gap between expectation and willingness has fueled one of NATO's most overlooked problems: credibility in the eyes of its own citizens. Many Europeans still assume the US will come to the rescue in a crisis, yet public opinion polls reveal a reluctance to commit their own troops in return. This imbalance has been politically weaponized by both sides of the NATO debate. Pro-NATO advocates argue it shows why Europe needs to invest more in its own military capabilities to ensure the alliance isn't a one-way street. NATO skeptics, however, see it as proof that the alliance fosters dependence and could drag their own countries into wars they don't want. In countries like Spain, Belgium, and Italy, where skepticism towards military spending was already strong, this framing resonated. Opposition parties began portraying NATO not as a mutual defense pact, but as an economic burden dictated by Washington. Even in traditionally pro-NATO nations, there is a growing unease about whether the alliance prioritizes matched domestic concerns, especially when social programs, climate initiatives, and infrastructure projects compete for the same budgetary resources.
You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain...
At its core, NATO's 5% defense spending target is as much a political arrangement as it is a security policy. On paper, the goal strengthens deterrence against Russia, enhances interoperability between allies, and ensures member nations share more of the financial burden. In practice, it also creates an unmistakable economic channel that routes a significant portion of European defense budgets towards US defense contractors, technology, and logistical frameworks. This isn't accidental. The US remains NATO's indispensable military power, providing the backbone of nuclear deterrence, high-end strike capabilities, and global logistical reach. For Washington, encouraging allies to spend more is not simply about readiness. It's also about reinforcing an economic ecosystem that sustains America's military-industrial complex. Every F-35 sale, every missile system order, and every long-term service contract ties European militaries closer to US suppliers and, by extension, US strategic influence. From this perspective, the 5% benchmark functions less like a neutral alliance goal and more like a transactional agreement. Buying American means buying proven systems, integrating seamlessly into NATO operations, and benefiting from decades of US research and development. But the trade-off is reduced autonomy and a heavier dependence on American supply chains. This is something that has long-term strategic implications, especially if US political support for NATO becomes more conditional, as hinted in Trump's rhetoric. In any case, the 5% target cements NATO as not just a military alliance, but an economic one. It links defense policy with transatlantic trade in a way that blurs the line between strategic necessity and commercial advantage. It is, in essence, a bargain. Europe buys more security by spending more money, much of it in US markets, and Washington secures both a stronger alliance and a stronger export base for its defense sector. Whether this strengthens NATO in the long run or undermines its unity by fostering dependency will depend on how much Europe invests in its own defense industrial capacity alongside this commitment. Until then, the 5% goal remains both a symbol of shared security and a reminder that in geopolitics, solidarity often comes with a price tag.